All right, I'm Tribune sports editor Aaron Falk here with Kevin Reynolds. BYU Cougars take on Stanford this weekend in Provo. I don't know if it's an interesting matchup. Maybe slightly more interesting than a week ago, Kevin. What are you expecting from this one out of the gate?
Just a little bit more than we saw at Portland State, but not much more, I don't think. I think if we saw Bear Bachmeier play a full game, I think I honestly would be a little bit surprised here just because Stanford is coming off of a loss to Hawaii in their opening week. And for the last 6 months, or really probably the last year, it's been a program completely in turmoil and change. They have a new head coach. They fired Troy Taylor. Andrew Luck comes in, and now you have a former NFL head coach coaching on an interim basis at Stanford. But to be honest, I really don't know if we know a ton about Stanford at this point, and I would be surprised just based on the first week if this was a considerably different challenge than what we saw in week one.
The one thing we do know about Stanford and BYU is that Stanford has been pretty instrumental in the creation of this roster. You got a story out on sltrib.com right now about some of those recruiting battles and relationships. What's strikes you about the way BYU has been able to add players like Bear Bachmeier and LJ Martin, who both had strong Stanford ties at one point?
That probably is actually the most interesting part of this game. Isn't the actual football, but it is the recruiting strategy that I think we're going to see very much on display on Saturday, because BYU's two best players when they go out on Saturday night will be Bear Bachmeier and LJ Martin, both who were committed to Stanford and did not have ties to BYU at all before growing up a high school football player, and somehow wind up in Provo, Utah, of all places, and against their former team now. And I think it's because what we've seen BYU do, and it's not unique to BYU, I think they've just done it particularly well, is they stay on guys and don't really give up, I don't think, on the recruitment when a player goes to a different school. And I think both of these guys are really good examples of that, because LJ Martin is an El Paso running back a guy who really, I don't think, considered BYU that much, to be honest, growing up. And yet he winds up at BYU because you see he goes to Stanford, or he commits to Stanford, and then all of a sudden there's a coaching change. David Shaw leaves. BYU is the last team to play Stanford, ironically, and they run 50 times for almost 400 yards that day. And BYU jumps right into the mix as soon as he decommits from Stanford, and you see Harvey Unga build up this relationship. And BYU, Kalani Sitake talks about it, of just never stop recruiting a guy even when he commits to another school. And Bear Bachmeier is another really good example of this. Troy Taylor gets fired. There's been a lot of turmoil at Stanford, and BYU had a relationship with him in high school. Fesi Sitake was a recruiter. Aaron Roderick was a recruiter on him during high school. He commits to Stanford really early, and it would be very easy, probably the smart decision, to just say, hey, we're going to pack it up and we're going to go to another recruit. But BYU just keeps these lines of communication open. And now you see, as soon as he decommits from Stanford, he too is now kind of interested in BYU, and BYU talks to the high school coach. They've always had a relationship with the parents, and now he's BYU starting quarterback. And I think you look around this roster, and there's actually a lot of guys on this roster in a weird way that didn't choose BYU, have had ties to BYU, and end up going to BYU. Andrew Gentry is an example, a local one. Keanu Tanavasa, I think, is a really good example of this, as he goes to Utah for a couple of years, and him and Kalani Sitake are very, very close, dating back to Keanu Tanavasa's mission, even. And now he's BYU's best defensive player. And I think I talked to Fesi Sitake about this. We wrote about it in the Trib. Is sometimes, like, he didn't phrase it like this, but I think I kind of phrase it like this: of sometimes it pays off to be the second best option, because you never know in a world where there's this many transfers when guys are going to a second option. So you might as well be in the mix for it.
Absolutely. 50% of divorces or marriages end in divorce. And so, let's keep the doors open, which I think, we had a story about Andrew Gentry coming to BYU, and this was really his second or third choice. And he had a quote in there, which, it's a little maybe fake humble for a guy with, as many stars as he has, but he's like, they could have really been upset and not wanted me. And that could have been a concern for him, but that door was always open. And, they always maintained within the rules of a relationship there.
And it goes back even, I would say it goes back even before the transfer portal exploded. Like, look at Puka Nacua, I think is a really good example of this too. A guy who goes to Washington and was the best player in the state by far. I mean, he's a kind of a guy like Andrew Gentry, where it's like, yeah, he was a really highly rated recruit, and was BYU ever gonna truly turn their back on him? Like, no, of course not. But at the same time, like, because they have a good relationship with the Nakuas, and they've had a long relationship with the Nakuas before Puka came, obviously. They've had a long line of Nakuas come through BYU, but he feels welcome to come to BYU, and he kind of steps right in, along with Samson Nakua too, and I think this is a strategy that Fesi Satake, I think, is very good at on the recruiting trail, just being able to keep just the lines of communication open. And then the other part of this, I asked him, I was like, well, how much time do you actually spend talking to guys who are not committed to your program, essentially? And he kind of deferred, and he was like, well, most of my attention is obviously on the guys who are going to be in this building. But at the same time, like, I think it is smart to devote 10-15% of your time to just keeping lines of communication open within the rules of recruiting, because you never know.
Absolutely. Like I said, not a ton to maybe make of this game this weekend, but what did Kalani Sitake say about, last weekend's performance, things maybe he liked, things he didn't, things we're keeping an eye on right now?
I think this is the first time I think I've covered BYU, and Kalani Sitake didn't really have a lot on a Monday where he just said this was worse than I thought. In fact, I thought he almost said it was better than he thought, which for 69-0 I thought was kind of interesting. Just because they've had so many people come into that game. I think they had upwards of 78, 79 players play in that game, and they all kind of performed pretty well. And to be honest, that's exactly all you're going to get out of Portland State. There's only downsides, I think, to that game, honestly. If you're looking at all a little bit vulnerable against Portland State, then you signal the alarm of like, oh, there's a lot of trouble here. But I think BYU got exactly what they needed out of it. And I think this week it's going to be a little bit of a hard scout, for two reasons, really. Hawaii plays a very different type of offensive style, so it's really difficult to gauge, if you're BYU, I think, what Stanford's going to show you, running a pretty traditional or more normal offense. And then the other part of that is Stanford's had a week off now. They played in week 0. BYU played in week 1, and with a completely new coaching staff over there, and they just don't have a lot of game film on Stanford as it is. How many wrinkles are there going to be in this offense for BYU, at least early on? And Kalani Sitake mentioned that, of like, we're kind of going in expecting that, kind of like Portland State did a little bit, but I don't think it should be anything where this is going to be a close game, or at least it shouldn't be.
Yeah, it's like a 20-point spread on the Vegas line right now. Yeah. So, and Frank Reich, Stanford's interim coach, says, asked about Bear Bachmeier's transfer, and like, is that an advantage for Stanford knowing what he can do as a quarterback? Is that an advantage for Bear knowing what Stanford does? Frank Reich says, we've changed so much since he left. I don't think it's an advantage to anybody. So should be an interesting one, at least for a quarter, and we'll see how many quarters Bear Bachmeier plays. Kevin, thanks so much for the time. We'll talk to you later.
Yeah, thanks.